Well, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you here face to face at this very special Friends event at the State Library. My name is Susan Hunt and I'm Director of the Foundation at the Library, and it is just so good to see so many friends and supporters here tonight. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their descendants on whose land this library now stands. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and any Aboriginal people here today. Now, the Foundation is the major fundraising arm of the library, and we assist the library in sharing, building, and conserving our unique collections. And our most recent projects were the wonderful new galleries that many of you have experienced, and we are just about to open new map rooms and also our new conservation lab. And after a year of great disruption, we decided for a particular Friends event that we would put on a special books and writing series to really emphasize how important our acclaimed writers were and are, and how much writing has sustained us over this period. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce our second lecture series, In Reflections in Conversation with Acclaimed Writers. And tonight's talk is the second in the series. Last week we had a wonderful talk by Robert Drew, and then tonight with Anna Funder, and next time with Marcus Zusak, discussing the body of their work in conversation with Nicole Abadie. So tonight I would very much like to extend a warm welcome to Anna Funder. We are really excited and very honoured that you accepted our invitation to come tonight. We are a great admirer of your work, and you will know that our bookstore has a number of books just ready and waiting for people to buy and enjoy tonight. And I think you said that you'd be happy to sign them. Yes. I'm also very excited to again welcome Nicole Abadie, who has developed this program with us. Thank you very much, Nicole. Library and literary consultant, podcaster and writer, Nicole writes for The Good Weekend and has a notable books podcast, Books, where she speaks to Australian and international writers on their latest work. I'm delighted to say she's also a judge for our 2021 New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards for the Christina Stead Prize for Fiction. So please give a warm welcome to our special guests, Nicole Abadie and Anna Funder.
Thank you so much, Sue, for that lovely introduction. Welcome to the second conversation in this three-part series of conversations with acclaimed Australian writers. Thank you so much to the State Library of New South Wales Foundation for hosting this series of events. And tonight, of course, I'm delighted to be in conversation with the much-loved Australian writer, Anna Funder. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Anna Funder. Her first book, Stasi Land, was published in 2002 and won the 2004 Samuel Johnson Prize, the world's most prestigious prize for non-fiction. It was published in 28 countries and became a bestseller all over the world. All That I Am, Anna's first novel, was published in 2011 and won a whole swag of awards, the Miles Franklin Prize, the Indie Book of the Year, the Australian Book Industry Book of the Year, and a number of other prizes that year. And it too spent a long time on the bestseller list. In 2011, Anna was named by the Sydney Morning Herald in the top 100 people of influence. And Anna has a PhD in creative writing from UTS and is a UTS luminary and Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow. Anna, welcome to the library tonight.
Thank you.
I'd like to start by asking you to do a short reading from your novel, which I'm sure is very well known to a lot of people in this room, All That I Am.
Sure, I'd love to. Am I on? Yes, excellent. Now I'm really on. I picked this up today and I realised that it looks like I've been making notes on my own book. It's kind of full of all of these things. I do actually remember this, even though it was a while ago. This is a scene towards the end. It's Ruth, who is one of the narrators of this book. She's an old woman. She's had an accident and fallen on New South Head Road. And there was a young woman there who picked her up off the road, and she happened to be a nurse in a nearby hospital, which in my mind was St. Vincent's. This is also my secret kind of Hitchcock moment where I imagine myself really as Hannah in this book, as somebody who just came across Ruth on New South Head Road. Although Hannah is probably a lot wiser than I am. This is very short. Knock, knock. So it's in Ruth's voice, I should say. Knock, knock. Who's there? I want to say. It's the only answer, isn't it? But I don't, because they're sending a hospital counsellor to assess me. And at my age, the line between dry and deranged can be hard, even for trained professionals to see. The woman is tall, with a blonde ponytail and honey-coloured glasses. Come in, I say instead. I'm Hannah, she says. I'm a counsellor in this hospital. Not religious? I ask. No, she smiles. Would that be a problem? Not my problem. I smile right back. You won't recognise me, Hannah says as she sits down next to the bed, but I saw your accident. I was walking with my daughter near the water and we saw you fall. I don't really, I say. No, she says, you wouldn't. Her voice is calm, her face open. We live in the flats near there because it's close to the hospital. Still, it's a coincidence, isn't it? She opens her clipboard and takes something out. Sarah wanted me to give you this. It's her daughter. She passes me a crayon drawing in bright colours where everything is on the same plane, sun and moon together in an aqua sky, which meets dark blue water in a perfect straight line, lots of triangular sails and a rosy-beaked pelican bigger than a yacht. In the foreground, there's a road. The drawing is painstakingly done. Bold crayon strokes make each thing moving, alive, except for a stick figure in a red triangle dress lying flat on the road. Cars with headlights like eyes bear down on her, but a little girl stick figure stands by her. She has a large hand, fingers like 5 spokes of a wheel, and with it, she holds the hand of the one on the ground. Thank you, I say after a while. I am very sorry she saw that your daughter saw. She's fine, Hannah says, passing me a tissue from the bedside table. An orderly comes to empty the bin. He's an old Vietnamese man and he smiles at us as at grandmother and granddaughter. The doctor comes every day, I tell her as the man leaves. That wasn't the doctor. There's a softness to her voice, but a firmness too. I know that, I say. I must make more of an effort if I want to go home and not into some sort of compulsory assisted cell for the weepy and confused. I was just saying, I say, the doctor comes to each cell every day. Hannah looks at me closely. I realise what I've said. Well, you know, compartment. She nods. They tell me that you were a teacher of literature, she says. Yes, French and German. Well, would you like me to bring you something to read? Hannah is looking at my bedside table, the high hospital thing, which is suddenly incriminatingly naked of decent reading material. You know, I say in my best teacher's voice, I've been rather busy. Her grey eyes widen just a little. Remembering, I explain. She nods again. It's all starting to make sense to me, I add. The nods get slower, the look closer, which can't be a good sign, can it? I laugh, and then Hannah does too. She is relieved, I think, to find me sane. Do you understand what's happening here? She asks then. I look at her and see that her job is hard. In terms of time elapsed and time to go, I say. She nods once more, picks up my hand. Dear, I say, you don't need to worry about me. And then we just sit, this stranger holding my hand. In the expanding silence, I wish to reassure her. The end is no problem for me. I willed it once and I can face it now. It's what happened in my personal 3-act circus. The cat's paw sleight of hand, the balls under cups and the trick pony, the man in the gorilla suit and the note in a pocket, the girl in the lake and the city's blown to dust that waits for me now. but I say nothing, lest I say, who, after all, would believe it. We don't understand one another. We may not ever give each other just what we need. All that remains is kindness. When she leaves, she stops at the nurses' station. I hear one of them tell her, you know, she was in prison under Hitler, in the resistance. Yes, Hannah says, a small clip in her voice. And let's not send her back there, shall we?
Thank you. Anna, you started at university studying English literature, German and law. And then when you finished, and you finished all of those subjects as well, I should say. You then started work as a lawyer, first of all doing your articles in a Melbourne law firm, and then working as a human rights lawyer in the Office for International Law in the AG's department in Canberra. You've said that you felt such a fraud as a lawyer because you were always thinking about writing. When did you know that when did you first know that you wanted to be a writer?
I first knew I wanted to be a writer. This sounds so ridiculous, but when I was 6, and it was ridiculous because I just wrote ridiculous stuff at the time. I couldn't spell and I had a typewriter and I wrote peons because I knew it was spelt unusually. But when I was 6, we'd been living in the States where my dad was doing postdoctoral work, and we moved to Paris. And so I started school in the local school in Paris at 6. And my mother, who was a psychologist, actually a child psychologist, interestingly enough, thought that she wouldn't trouble me or make me anxious by saying to me, you're going to a school where you won't understand a word. So I rocked up at school and didn't understand a word. And then I learned French pretty quickly, as small children do. And apparently my mother had the good grace to say that I came home from school that day and she said to me, very, very worried, you know, she was bearing all the anxiety, I guess. She said, how was school? And I said, fine. That's all I would say. So I think that tells you a lot about my maternal relationship. But so I think from that time, I understood that, language was this sort of magic curtain, really. You had to have access to it. It was a screen. Things could be said differently in different languages. In French, you have mal au foie, which is something wrong with your liver when you're frightened, or lots of things seem able to be expressed differently. And then I was just obsessed with language. So I think it happened then. But the thing about being a fraud is true. I'm feeling like this is probably the most well-researched interview I've ever done. But I had this fabulous, amazing job, my absolute dream job, and yours, as I understand it as well, in this little office in the Attorney General's Department in the 90s, which was giving international law advice to the Australian government and negotiating treaties. And a lot of it was based on Section 52 of the Constitution. And so it was about implementing international treaties into Australian law and what powers those treaties gave the federal government. And they were human rights treaties and rights of the child treaties and environmental treaties and air and space and sea law, and absolutely fascinating and really, really lovely, lovely colleagues. And then there was a chance to go and work at DFAT in the diplomatic service. And I had always thought that that would be something that I would possibly do as well. And I just realized I've got my absolute dream jobs, as you were referring to them earlier. But everyone else around me is living their real lives. And I'm taking notes.
For the books
I'm taking notes.
that you're going to write?
I don't know. I'm just taking notes. I'm just writing notes from life. And that made me feel like someone else would have been better doing what I was doing there, that I needed to just go and write. I think there's also a level at which human rights law, or even perhaps possibly, I know there are many lawyers, some of whom I know and admire very much in this room. There's a level at which the law, possibly particularly international law, and then possibly particularly international human rights law, are fictional claims. We all have the right to X and Y and Z, women in this country have the right to X and Y and Z. They're important, they can be turned into fact, but at one level, those things are fiction. I wanted to look at what was really going on.
Anna, what we're going to do is look at your two main books, Stasi-Land
Yes.
and then All That I Am. And then I actually have got a few questions near the end about your law and your work in human rights and how that's informed your writing. So let's start now with Stasi-Land, which was published in 2002. You'd long had an interest in Germany. I know that you'd learned German at school and at university. You had spent time in West Berlin as an exchange student before the wall came down. And then you returned to Germany in 1994 after the wall had come down in 1989. And while you were there, you visited the former Stasi offices in Leipzig, which at that stage had become a Stasi museum. I'd like you to tell us what you saw there, and I'd like you to focus especially on the collection of empty jars that you saw there.
Yes. So I left Canberra, I left the law, I left my boyfriend, I left Australia. I saved some money, I went to Berlin. And I didn't know what I was really going to do there, but I had heard the story of Miriam, which became this kind of central story in what became Stasi-Land, the book. And I'd heard it from the woman who ran the Citizens, it was like a civil rights activist run museum in Leipzig that some of you may know, in what was the Stasi headquarters for Saxony, a building called the Runde Ecke, the round corner. It should be a sign really of some sort of confusion. And this building was just as the Stasi had left it when they'd tried to clear it and they'd tried to get rid of a lot of files and a lot of evidence. But when the civil rights activists stormed all of the Stasi headquarters in the 14 different districts, the Stasi had then left, and then they'd turned some of those into museums, and this was one of those. And yes, there was all sorts of things. There were bugs that looked a bit like what I'm wearing today, and there was at the back shelves, like great big kind of metal shelves, full of what looked like jam jars, like Fowler's for cola bottling jars, and they were empty, and they had on them stickers which might in a normal world say, cherry jam to 2020, instead of which these stickers said workers' underpants, and then a date. And I asked what these things were, and they were jars for the collection of smell samples of the bodily odor of all of the opposition of Leipzig. And
how had they obtained those?
Well, they obtained them by, there are different methods. I mean, the Stasi essentially was a secret service that could do anything it wanted. It was all powerful. It could call you in for questioning on a vinyl chair, not unlike this one, and then wipe it afterwards with a cloth and get your bodily odor that way. It could break into your house or your flat when you're not home and steal a piece of your dirty underwear and get it that way. It was incredibly intrusive. Some of the Stasi men I subsequently spoke to did say to me it was also incredibly effective. So
they had dogs that were trained.
They could train a dog to recognize your smell, and then they could take that dog to a border installation or to somewhere where you shouldn't have been. And I don't know exactly what the dogs did, like whether they kind of knocked once or twice, for a positive result or not. But they obviously barked and were trained to make a recognition. But I think one of the other really chilling things about that, if that's not chilling and weird enough, was that when the opposition stormed the Runde Ecke, the jars that they found were empty. So in the peaceful revolution of 1989, going into 1990, somebody had taken the cloths that were impregnated with the smell of the entire political opposition in Saxony and put them somewhere else, thinking that they might just come in handy. No one ever found them.
No one ever found where they went.
No one ever found them. Yeah.
Anna, you returned to Berlin in 1996 and 7 as a writer in residence at the Australian Centre in Potsdam. And when you were there, you met up with the woman who you mentioned before, Miriam, who you had been told about. Could you tell us a little bit about Miriam and her story of her experiences under the Stasi?
Yes, there was this beautiful woman who was running the Stasi Museum, and there was never anyone there. And they had no money. They had sort of all the exhibits up with thumbtacks around the place and everything. It was very hand-to-mouth kind of activist symbol of the regime that had gone on, and there was getting no money from West Germany or anything like that. Never anyone there. I got talking to the woman who was there, and I said to her, I'd really like to speak to some people who've got stories to tell. And she said, well, the Stasi won't speak to you, you won't find them. But some other people might. So this is 7 years after the end of the regime. So on the one hand, people were also telling me, we know everything that there is to know about that regime. Why would you bother? It's all over, done and dusted. And other people were saying, no one will ever talk to you because it's too sensitive. So you sort of, I didn't know I was walking into this situation. She said, you should talk to Miriam. I think I know someone who'll talk to you. She has a story about her husband. And that's really all she told me. But then when I went, I made a time to come and see Miriam. It was the first time she told anybody her story. And her story started off with herself trying at the age of 16 to get over the Berlin Wall in 1968 on New Year's Eve. So she took me right back into a whole other world. And then her story went on from there.
What happened to her when she tried to get across the wall at the age of 16?
Yes, well,
she was almost successful.
She was almost successful. So what had happened was the regime had pulled down a beautiful church in Leipzig, which, as we know, is the city of Bach and beautiful music, and in 68, and people protested against that, including Miriam and her friend Ursula, and they handmade with little like letter-set sticky letters, roneoed some leaflets that they then put up illegally around town with glue that protested this and said, if you're going to do something like that, please let us know. We need to be able to talk about this. But the regime took that as a sign of very bad attitude, which of course it was. And the Stasi investigated, they brought in all of the kids at school for questioning, and eventually they narrowed it down. They found some of the letters in Miriam's carpet. They arrested her, they put her on, this is where a human rights background comes a little bit in useful. They put her on remand with no lawyer and no contact with her parents and no telephone for a month, and then subjected her to sleep deprivation. She was 16 years old, and interrogated her. And then they let her out to wait for her trial, because the regime was called the German Democratic Republic, and they did all of this kind of horrifically ironic lip service to democratic practices in a way. So they let her out after her remand period, and she knew that when she went back and she was going to have this completely rigged trial and she'd go back to jail, she thought, I'm going to try and get out. So she put herself on a train to Berlin, where she'd never been, to the Big Smoke. She managed to find the wall, and she managed literally on hands and knees with nothing, no help, no equipment to climb over, and she nearly made it. Which meant when she didn't make it, she was brought back into custody, and no one in the Stasi could believe that she'd gotten so far without an underground organization helping her. There were these underground escape organizations. So that was when they really set in with the sleep deprivation to find that out. So she sort of was almost an accidental activist or an accidental political prisoner at 17. That's what happened to her.
And after you spoke to her and you found out her story, what had happened to her, and subsequently to her husband, hearing her story made you curious to learn more about the Stasi. So you posted an ad in the local newspaper, having been told by people no one will talk to you. You posted an ad in the local newspaper saying that you wanted to speak to former Stasi and unofficial collaborators for interview. And as I gather from the first thing the next morning, that the phone started to run off the hook. Before we get to that and who you were getting the calls from, I was interested to know, did you know at that stage that you were going to write a book about the Stasi? Or at that stage, were you just making was your interest stimulated, you were just sort of making some initial inquiries?
This sounds incredibly naive and also ridiculously ambitious, but I thought I would write a book. I didn't know what that book would be, and I assumed it would be a novel. And I just assumed it would be a novel because I don't know why. But I didn't think about writing nonfiction, even though I'd spent my adolescence reading Chatwin and Kapuscinski and all sorts of very interesting and wonderful nonfiction. I started writing a novel at one point, and I started it with Miriam's story, and it was just execrable, and it was execrable in its own right, but it also had kind of moral problems which turned out to be aesthetic problems as well, and they're ones that I continue to be really exercised by in my whole writing life. And at that point I didn't know what this was that I was facing. It was the first time, and it was because I was talking to people like Miriam who had stories that had never been told, that were not being told, that were not in the newspapers. At that time, Germany was desperate to unite, and like a lot of places that had been divided into us and them, to get along. So the sort of mantra was, everybody's going to get along. But to get along, you have to forget a lot about what certain people have done and the resistance as well to what they did. And that didn't sit very well with me. And I was really interested in people like Miriam who'd done something to resist it. And I just thought, I'm walking around the streets of Berlin in 1997. I could be going into the supermarket. Miriam's interrogator, some ex-Stasi man disguised now as a, Western entrepreneur, could be the hairy hand that reaches over me to get the ticket at the deli or whatever. These stories are live. All of these people are walking around now in this town. And
so the Stasi and their victims.
The Stasi and their victims, exactly. And it's not material for me. It's not right that I should make that into some novel that then privileges my voice, a novelist's voice or view on that. I think that these stories just have to be told, and they have to be told. The truth has to be told. So that meant that book had to be nonfiction. So then I did set about gathering, in a kind of haphazard and amateurish way that you've just alluded to, other stories.
Well, not at all. You'd been told that you weren't going to be able to speak to them. So you just did something really simple, and you started, as I gather, to get responses straight away. What I'd like you to tell us about is some of the people that you spoke to, some of the ex-Stasi men, and they were men, who you spoke to, and some of the stories that you heard from them. What did you learn from them?
So the Stasi was a men's club. It was a military organized by rank male organization. And I didn't think about it like that at the time, but I certainly think about that now. And the statute of limitations on their crimes had not run out at the time that I was writing this book, which meant that they had really gone to ground, not out of Minor, which was a newspaper in Potsdam. Potsdam was just full of ex-cadre. And I had someone check my German because I just thought, I don't know how to write. It's very hard for people to understand before the internet, probably what the story means. But there's an art to writing small advertisements for newspapers, and I just didn't know that I had that down in German. So I had someone check the ad. In any event, it came out in what was the personal columns of this newspaper, which I hadn't
looking
intended.
To meet ex-Stasi men.
Yes, exactly. So it said, Australian writer, even though I wasn't really yet, seeks Stasi men, view conversation. So many lies to unpack in that statement, I think. Anyway, so the phone did ring hot. It was the days of landlines, and there were lots and lots of people who had a lot to get off their chest, and they wanted to speak to me, almost all of them anonymously. One of them did say, and I kind of regret this, that he had been an unofficial collaborator, which was like somebody who wasn't going off every day to work at the Stasi, but someone like in this room, say in East Germany, there would have been, 4 or 5 or 10, if I was important enough, spies in here who'd go off and talk to their handlers. So
who'd inform on
your neighbours and friends and school children and students and factory workers and church members, and they were absolutely everywhere. The Stasi was, we don't know what's happening in North Korea, but it was, as far as we know, the most thorough secret service that there has been. There was 1 in every 7 people were reporting on everybody else.
So just stop you there for a moment, because I think that's a really interesting point. You make that point in the book, that these were the most surveilled, if that's a word, or the most surveyed group of people ever. And Anna quotes in the book the statistics of Nazi Germany and other regimes where there'd been informers and surveillance, and the figures, the statistics of the number of surveyors as to the surveyed. And yes, as you make the point, the ratio was never so small as it was in East Germany, where if you included all of the collaborators, the informal ones, it was a 1 to 7. Quite extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. It was what I was really mostly interested in the stories like Miriam's, and there are 4 of those in the book: Miriam, Julia, Frau Paul, and Klaus Renft, this gorgeous louche alcoholic East German Mick Jagger, he called himself, or was known as. They're the 4 sort of anchoring stories, because the thing that really I turned out to be most curious about was, what is it in apparently ordinary people like any of us that gives them the courage to resist in such an extreme situation? And it just struck me as a kind of kernel of what it is that is most extraordinary about human beings, because these were very ordinary. Is such a silly word, it's so used, but you know what I mean. There's a dental technician, a student, a housewife, an alcoholic rock star. What is it that gives a person that sort of courage to say, actually, I don't care what you do to me. I don't care what you do to my life. I don't care how you bend it out of shape. I will not collaborate, because if I do, essentially, I will no longer recognize myself as a moral being. And I thought, when I was sitting in the room with those 4 people, that is actually what I'm witnessing. You know, that is what I'm seeing, these incredible decisions that people have made not to betray other people at their own enormous cost, a cost they couldn't have imagined. And then I thought, if I'm doing that with those guys, I really need to see what they were up against, and hence the ads, and then going to see, having all these fairly bizarre assignations with Stasi men who were thrilled to have an audience, you know.
Anna, the book's called Stasi-Land. It took me a little while to get this, but I suddenly joined the dots. There are regular references throughout it to you feeling as if you were Alice in Wonderland. You talk about things that are curiouser and curiouser. I wondered, why did you choose that analogy and that title? And did you learn, well, what you learned both from the victims of the Stasi and from the ex-Stasi themselves, did it shock you?
Everything was shocking. It was like a perverted world. It was like a world turned inside out, with this rhetoric, which stuck in my craw, I guess, as an ex-human rights lawyer, of human rights. So the GDR, in its own rhetoric, was the German Democratic Republic. It was the most humane Germany that had ever existed. All the fascists had disappeared overnight in 1945 into the West. Job done. They were automatically brothers with the Russian comrades that they'd been fighting in the hot war until 5 minutes before. There was no prostitution, there was no unemployment. This is all the rhetoric. No prostitution, no unemployment, no inequality. The sexes were equal. And actually, growing up during the Cold War in Melbourne in the 80s and learning German, I went to a school that had a very strong sense of social justice and was a girls' school, quite a feminist school. And we were told, maybe it was because it was Catholic, I don't know, to sort of suspend judgment. So we studied East German literature and West German literature kind of separately, and we were told, we can't judge what's going on there. It may well be a better world if women really are equal, if there really is no prostitution, and so on and so forth. So I think for me, just to examine that, what it's like to live in this zone of hypocrisy and lies, is like having the world turned inside out. And I think that was why the Alice in Wonderland analogies were there, or seemed real.
As you've said, what you did that was really so unique was that you told the stories of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of courage, and ordinary people who became Stasi and performed the most terrible deeds. What you said as a reason for your work, you called it working against forgetting and against time. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What did you hope would come from telling these stories?
Tonight feels like a kind of kind of sort of chain confession of
Not a
naivety.
Stasi interrogation. I
Yeah,
hope.
no. Well, I really thought very naively that telling the stories of these 4 heroic, ordinary people would make a difference to them, and that putting those stories out into the public in Germany would make a difference somehow to the discussion of East Germany. At that time, the East Germans were kind of seen as, the German word is the Mecke-Ecke, like the whingy corner of Germany. They were never satisfied with anything. They'd had this dictatorship they'd failed to resist for a long time. They were either collaborators or with the Stasi. There was this no sense that there'd been this very deep resistance. And I thought, look, after the Second World War, there's been a big celebration of, say, Hans and Sophie Scholl, so the resistance to Hitler. In many towns and cities all over Germany, there are squares and parks named for Hans and Sophie Scholl, who were some of the resistance, some of the most famous. They leafleted against Hitler in 1942, quite late in the piece, and were executed for it. And I thought, I am really finding similar stories of heroism in the same place as those stories of resistance to Hitler, the same nation, the same culture, and they're not being told. So this will make a difference. But it was completely wrong. The book came out in Germany. I did a 10-city tour of Germany, former East and West. And it wasn't until I did that tour that I understood why the book it came out and it sat on this wound, or it sat on this area of unspeakability somehow, or perhaps it was too early, I don't know. The way that I understood what had happened was at the book launch for Stasiland in Germany, it was a massive hall in the Runde Ecke, in the ex-Stasi's building, in what had been their kind of ballroom. So it was literally in the secret policeman's ballroom at the Stasi book fair, at the Leipzig book fair in 2004. And I could see that my publisher, who was introducing at a lectern like this, was terrified. And I just thought, why is she so, butterflies maybe, why is she so scared? And I got up and I looked down, and the first 2 rows where these friends are and where you guys are was full of ex-Stasi or ex-party men. And they were utterly recognizable in Brill cream bomber jackets, polyester trousers with a nice firm crease, and so on. And they took out notebooks as I started to talk and started scribbling these notes, and they were huffing and puffing really aggressively. And that's when the penny sort of finally started to drop, that, if you write about a place that is still riven, this is what's going to happen. The people are all still here.
I was just going to say, and they had also tried to get an injunction to stop the book from being published in Germany, hadn't they?
Well, what happened was, yes, that happened, but that happened later. So what happened in that minute was that they started taking notes. Then the session ended and it was opened up for questions. And these Stasi men all got up. The chairs were like movable. They weren't, you guys are all kind of pinioned in there, but they got up and moved their chairs really loudly and kind of stormed out because they didn't want to hear any questions. And then somebody stood up at the back, a woman, and said, why is it that it takes a foreigner to come and tell our stories? And my son was in prison. These things happen to all of us. Why can't we tell our own stories? And I just thought, you know what? I think your answer just left the room. That is why they can't be told. That happened in Leipzig, it happened in Dresden, it happened in Oxford, it happened in all of the former East German places. I got back to Australia, to my house in Glebe, where I still live, and I was upstairs working in the attic, and I got an email saying that this group of ex-Stasi were suing me. And I thought, wow, they have extended their reach, to the other end of the world. So I thought, what do I need? You'll like this, Nicole. I need a cup of tea. So I went downstairs, thought I've got to think about this for a bit, and I turned the tap on and no water came out. And of course, I'm a domestic, the I just thought they're going to thirst me out of here.
Oh my God.
It was waterworks in the street. It was fine. But they did succeed in having a paragraph about the activities, the alleged activities. We're all saying alleged so much in these weeks lately, aren't we? The alleged activities, as I'd put very carefully in the book, of members of a group of Stasi who used to be called the Insider Committee, which had changed its name to the Society for the Protection of Civil Liberties and the Dignity of Man, because they were getting with the human rights discourse after the fall of the wall. So I think all of these things stuck in my craw. They managed to have a paragraph about their activities, a whole lot of chicanery, annoying and worse civil rights activists in the West or in United Germany in the 90s, well into the 90s, cutting brake leads and picking up their children from school and delivering pornography and doing all this stuff. So they had that paragraph taken out.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to stop you
Yes.
because I'm just caught sight of the time and realised that we want to get to talk about All That I Am as well. So
No
if you
worries.
don't mind, I'll stop you there. I wish that I had hours on end to talk to Anna about all of these books. Let's get to your novel, All That I Am, which was published in 2011. So that's based on the true story of your dear friend Ruth Blatt, who you met in Melbourne when you were 19, and I think she was about 60 years older than you. What was her story, and how did you use it as the basis of your novel? I'm particularly interested in you telling us how you wove the facts in with the fiction.
So Ruth Blatt was my German teacher at school's German teacher. So she had taught at MLC in Melbourne in the 50s, and then she taught my German teacher, who then taught me. And I met her when I finished school because my German teacher, who was really fantastic and who I loved, didn't want me pestering her for a reference to try and get to Germany, which is fair enough. And so she fobbed me off onto Ruth, which was great. Ruth was this old woman wearing a wig because when she'd been in prison under the Nazis, all her hair had fallen out. She had a crutch. She was wild. She loved Goethe's poetry. She was a fantastic role model for a young woman. She'd sort of bypassed all domesticity, all parenting. Quite a good role model for me now, actually. And I really loved her. And we were friends for many, many years. And I thought I knew all her stories. And then when she died in 2001, I was very pregnant with my first child. And I thought I'll go and research her life. She had been in a very small anti-Hitler group that had to flee for London. As soon as Hitler came to power, they were on the first blacklist to leave. They were called the Socialist Workers' Party. And they continued to be active against Hitler in London underground because it was a time of high appeasement. And the Brits really didn't want, even though they gave refuge to these anti-Hitler activists, they didn't want them doing anything of any political nature while they were there. It was very hard if you're a political activist against Hitler, and that is kind of your nature, and that's why you're in exile, not to do anything.
And the threat was if you did, you'd be sent back to Germany.
You'd be sent back to Germany. So it was
This
only
1933, 1934 you're writing about.
Yes, 33. And then two of them were found dead in bed together in 1935, members of this tiny party, friends of Ruth's, with the two women who shared a flat, who were not in a relationship together, in a bed together with the covers drawn up to their chins and neatly tucked in. I think that was the thing that most kind of enraged me, because the week they had died of veronal poisoning. Verona was a sleeping draught, but if you took too much of it, you would sleep forever. The cups of that veronal disappeared. The coroner's inquest the next week, which was instructed not to admit any evidence of political activity by these political activists who were now dead in a bed in Bloomsbury, found suicide by reason of unsound mind due to romantic disappointment. I think even in our age of, we have a way to go in gender relations, but we've come further than verdicts like that. Yeah.
Anna, you tell the story in a very interesting way. The real heroine of the story emerges as Dora Fabian, who's Ruth's friend, but we don't hear from her directly. You tell the story from two different perspectives, one from a man called Ernst Toller, who was a real German playwright. And in your book, He's writing from exile in 1939. He's in New York, and he's re-editing his autobiography, inserting back in the parts about Dora, who was his lover. So we've got his perspective, and then the other perspective we have is Ruth, who you talked about and who you opened about. She's now an old woman living in Bondi Junction. Toller's autobiography, and she's interspersing her own memories of Dora and that time in London as she reads the book. Why did you choose to tell it in that way? Why did you choose that structure?
I should say that I made Ruth and Dora cousins when they were actually friends, because female friendship is complicated in political groups. It's complicated. I just wanted to have relationships that were pretty clear, where I could describe their family of origin as well. So things like that are altered. Everybody in the book is real, and everything that happened pretty much happened, although no one knows what happened in that locked room in Bloomsbury in 1935. I have to say, just parenthetically and briefly, I started research on this in 2006 in London. I was going to the archives trying to find the coroner's reports and all of that sort of thing. And that was when, some of you may remember, a Russian dissident called Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned very flamboyantly by Putin operatives working on behalf in Putin's interests in London. And he took 3 weeks to die. And I just thought, oh my Lord, Putin has stolen my plot. I'm so cranky. I told it like that because at the heart of this book is a dead woman. And as I was writing this, I was watching lots of, my husband used to call them the Friday Night Nazis on SBS. But I would come home and I would watch CSI this and FBI Miami and all of these police procedurals just to sort of get words out of my head and just to veg out. And they all started with a young dead woman, preferably attractive, preferably naked on some slab being pulled out. And the entire drama of the piece was between the perpetrator and the cop. That was the part of it, that was the tension. And I just thought, no, I want my woman who is the center of this to be alive. And I want the tension of this book to be that she would like to stay alive. You know, I don't want a dead woman on the slab. I don't want anybody investigating. And also somebody's cousin who's really admiring and somebody's lover who's very loving are going to have the most intimate view of this person who otherwise is a public figure. You can look her up. And I wanted those two intimate views that are different, but that refract things that they know about her, so that we learn these most intimate things that a narrator, another character, an omniscient narrator even might not know. It has more power if it's these two intimate views. So that's why.
Anna, both of those books, and I should mention, Anna's also written a beautiful novella, which we don't have time to talk about tonight. It's called The Girl with the Dogs, and it's in a sense an homage to a short story written by Chekhov. I know that's available tonight as well, and I recommend it to all of you. It's a very beautiful book. What I wanted to ask you is, I wanted to come back to something we talked about at the beginning, and that's the extent to which your background as a lawyer, in particular, an international lawyer, a human rights lawyer, informs your writing. And in particular, I was wondering, you write in both of these books about oppression, tyranny, persecution, courage, dissidence, resistance. How important is it to you to write about issues around social justice? So yeah, the first part of the question was the extent to which your legal background has informed your writing, and the second part was, how important is it to you personally to write about issues that relate to social justice?
I think the legal background was very important in some ways. It was very, there's a scene in a nightclub, which is actually the only scene in All That I Am, where all the characters are sitting around together. And they're in this fabulous Berlin nightclub. And it's actually the night that the Reichstag, the parliament, is set on fire. And my characters are these, well, they were these real people who are activists. Some of them have been in prison for it, anti-Hitler activists, and they have to decide what to do. And I had to describe for readers how Hitler took over government from within democratic practice, if you like. So it was a kind of constitutional coup. And I once told a theatre director this, actually, a friend in London. I said, it took me 6 weeks to write that scene. And he said, oh my God, we've got whole productions that go on in 6 weeks. even with a legal background, but I really wanted to get that right so that you could see from within how something that looks legally or constitutionally unlikely comes to pass, and the characters are talking about that. The social justice aspect, I don't set out to write books, consciously about those things at all. I think that I was brought up in a household, a kind of intellectual household where social justice was very important. And I think that those stories of courage and resistance are attractive partly because of that political content, partly if you're a human rights or international lawyer, you're interested in constitutions and you're interested in failed states in the way that a doctor is interested in disease. You know, the disease itself isn't fascinating. What you're really interested in is the whole human or the healthy human. But to get there, you have to go via when it fails, when the system failure. So I think that was a legal background was useful for that. The social justice thing, I'm not conscious of that. Clearly, it's in the books. I think it's more that in situations that are politically extreme, human beings behave in remarkable and dramatic ways that are very interesting to me and that I want to either represent or bear witness to in one way or another. Yeah.
Anna, thank you. I've had time to ask lots of questions. I've got more, but I'd like to offer you the opportunity now to ask Anna a question. If anybody would like to, there's a microphone here. Jenny.
I don't need a microphone. I've got a really loud voice. And I could have listened to you guys for another hour. I wish we could. But I did want to know what happened to Miriam and the people that you wrote about after the book came out and what that relationship was like, because I would imagine there was some bravery involved from them letting you have that story if you had all those people really angry at what they said.
Yes, exactly. So Miriam, that's such a good question, Jenny. Thank you. Miriam said to me at the time, oh, you can just use my real name. I don't care. It's fine. And I, was very naive and didn't really know what I was doing. But I did think, I just don't know what this is going to be when I'm finished with it. And I don't know what the repercussions for anybody are going to be. So I changed her name. On one of these tours of Germany, the sort of David Letterman late night show wanted to have me on with her. And she's, I think, probably one of the bravest people I've ever met and ever will meet in my life. And she just said to me that she wouldn't come on because Germany had changed so much that she didn't really feel safe coming on. And I said, why? And she said, so her job was to work in public radio in Saxony. So she was working essentially for Radio National, which is state-based in Germany. But one of her bosses was ex-Stasi, and one of them was an informer, and they knew that she had been a political prisoner. Their interest was in downplaying on all of the news programs and other programs the perfidy of that state. So she watched as they would put news items that revealed some latest Stasi madness or badness to the bottom of the news or leave it out altogether. Or basically in more recent years, the media really would like to represent in the East, often East Germany as a kind of welfare state that went tiny little bit too far, but basically had good intentions. So she wasn't keen on that. And she just said, it's going to make my working life too difficult if I come on television. So there were definitely repercussions for people. Yeah.
Any other questions? Susie.
Yeah. What date did 1996, the cut-off date had to be arrived, by which time you would be able to be charged? What date was that?
I think from memory it's 2000 or 2001. So the regime, or the regime ends at the end of 89, 1990 is reunification. So the East German law, I think they had a 10-year on some things. Not murder and those things that have no statute of limitations, also here, but they're very hard to prove because the Stasi set about very effectively destroying their own files on people at the end of the regime. Yes.
Can you tell them about has anybody else got any questions? There's something I'd love you all to hear about. Sorry, go on.
One of the things you didn't point out, come into life underneath that train section. Stasi had all their, is that true?
I
Something like coming into Central Station, and underneath it is, oh,
I love the image of that. I've never been told that. That's new to me.
Anna, I'd love you to share the story of the puzzle of what
Oh.
happened in 1989 to all of those. Anna in Stasi-Land says all the files that were collected in East Germany, if you laid them end to end, they would go for 180 kilometres. So there was a mad rush after 90 or leading up to November 1989 to destroy the files. And they started with shredders. What happened?
Yes. So the East German regime took basically the records of that regime, which consist in large part of the stolen biographies of its people, more than all the written records of the whole of Germany since the Middle Ages. So they were busy. They had a lot to shred. They started shredding as the Monday demonstrations were happening all in 1989, the candlelit processions and so on. They pulled shutters down on all of their headquarters, and the order went out to get rid of all the files. So they put them through shredders. The shredders died because it was a command economy. They didn't make enough shredders. They had to send agents out to West Berlin to sneak back some shredders. Then they all died as well. Then they tried pulping them, and they couldn't burn them because that would attract too much attention from the demonstrators, who would realize that they were burning all the records and the evidence. Then the order went out to hand rip. And there are 15,000 sacks now in East Germany still of the hand-ripped material of the most important files. So what happened to Miriam, what happened to her husband, all the deaths in custody. The files of the Foreign Service, which was manipulating the vote in the West German parliament and doing all sorts of other things, running terrorists and many other things. They all, first of all, the CIA took them all to America. And then the East Germans were allowed to get rid of them themselves. So we're just talking about the records of on their own people. Those sacks still exist, and it's a whole other story, possibly a whole other book, why they haven't been reconstructed. But you can read the beginning of that story in Stasi.
Can you quickly tell them about the puzzle workers in Nuremberg?
So I was very curious about piecing back together, particularly because Miriam's husband had died in Stasi custody as a young, very fit man. And she had been heartbroken, and she was hoping, when I was talking to her, that some of these hand-ripped files in these huge sacks would contain evidence about what had happened to Charlie. So I went to this place, which I thought would be wonderfully German and efficient, full of people in kind of hairnets with computers and, you know, like very, very sort of Star Trek or something. I don't know why I thought that. This is like a confession of my incredible naivety in every way. I went to this place and there were 31 people puzzling together in rooms with pot plants, cups of tea, posters of kittens on the walls, open windows, literally sitting there puzzling together with sticky tape these hand-ripped files.
The 15,000 bags of
There
them.
were some of tiny portion. And as I left there, the archivist, whose name was Herr Rayar, said to me, you know, I'm retiring. I love it when people are retiring or about to go to leave office. I said, oh, that's interesting. And then he slipped me this note. And on that note was a calculation. We only have 31 people. If we had a full complement of 40, at the current rate of constituting X sacks per person per day, it's going to take us 375 years to reconstitute the files on the East German people. So that hasn't happened yet. And it's a whole other story, but yes, it's crazy.
Anna, thank you so much for talking to us tonight.
Thank you so much. It was very special. And now there are many books awaiting for sale and signature, but Anna, you might go to the front of the bookstore and we can resume our talk and our chat there. Thank you so much for coming.